Darwin was also a very experienced cultivator of plants and a breeder of animals. And he realized that vegetables that we think of as remarkably different, such as Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cauliflower, have all been produced from the same ancestral wild mustard plant, believe it or not, by careful cultivation in the hands of plant breeders. So he realized that plants in nature show so much variation that a breeder can select for these different characteristics to produce plants that to us look completely different. And he realized that nature does exactly the same thing. And Darwin's insight was that there was a force in nature which he called natural selection, and that natural selection automatically selected for animals and plants that were best adapted to their environment. The variation that appears in nature is acted upon by natural selection. And Darwin put this sketch, it was the only picture in The Origin of Species, to illustrate how he thought his process would work. And that is, a species would develop increasing variation until finally it split into two, a process called speciation that results in the formation of new species. Once diversity divides the species into two, each of these new species can be acted on separately by natural selection. And this is where species come from. Contrary to popular imagination, evolution doesn't transform one species into another. It takes existing species and splits them into 2 or 3 separate species, which then go their own way and evolve in separate directions. What impressed Darwin was that he thought he could actually see this process in motion. On the Galapagos Islands, off the western coast of South America, he found a number of species of birds which clearly had different styles of life. Some of them were woodpecker-like, some of them were finch-like, some of them were warbler-like. He bagged these animals, meaning he shot them, preserved them, brought them back to England, and gave them to bird experts, and the bird experts told him, "You aren't going to believe this. That thing you thought was a woodpecker, it's a finch. The thing you thought was a warbler, it's a finch. The thing you thought was a finch, well, it is a finch." And it turns out that on these islands, there were no fewer than 13 different species of finch that in just a few million years had evolved from a single common ancestor that had flown to these distant islands from the South American mainland. Because these were the first birds to colonize it, these birds split and split and split again, and were able to adapt to every one of these individual styles of life on the island. It's worth noting this same process is happening right now in various places throughout the world. For example, scientific reports of an insect called the walking stick in California have shown that walking sticks right now are splitting into 2 species, one of which prefers to hang out on one kind of plant and the other of which prefers to hang out on another type due to camouflage reasons. These species can these 2 populations can almost be considered separate species. And this sort of process, therefore, happens, and it happens today. Now, we're able to analyze, Darwin couldn't do this, what goes on by genetics. And genetics has shown us that these sort of isolating mechanisms, which divide species into 2, can develop in just a few years. In the case of fish, 60 or 70 years. In the case of mice, as few as a few hundred years, and in the case of flies and other microorganisms, perhaps just a few generations. So it's extraordinary that not only do these changes continue to take place, but we can study them with modern genetic mechanisms. Now, these ideas have implications. And the implications are that we ought to be able to look at the fossil record and find a record of common ancestry. It turns out we can't. We've known for years, for example, that swimming mammals like whales and dolphins have evolved from terrestrial mammals, and they did so about 80 or 90 million years ago. And it turns out that the oldest known living whale, the oldest known fossil whale, up to about 20 years ago, which was called Basilosaurus, and this is a Basilosaurus skeleton, is remarkably transitional. It doesn't have a blowhole. It still breathes from the very tip of the nose. It actually has tiny little hind legs, or a pelvic girdle here, concealed inside the skeleton. So it clearly is an intermediate form, but a lot of people who might be critical of evolution might say, yeah, well, if this really happened, where are the intermediates? Well, that's a good question. It turns out that about 15 years ago, a group of investigators in the Middle East began to discover fossils that clearly were whale-like fossils. And once they realized that this was where this evolutionary process took place, they began to look harder. And when they looked harder, they found a series of fossils that were remarkably intermediate. Fossils that clearly were terrestrial organisms that had begun to adapt to the ocean. So how many different species did they find? 1 or 2 to plug up the gaps? Well, no fewer than 5. And recent estimates suggest perhaps a dozen or more. And we now understand in great detail how mammals made the transition back to the water and where modern whales and dolphins came from. And it's an evolutionary process that we understand, not completely, because we don't understand anything completely in science, but we certainly understand it well enough to know that evolution drove the change. And this sort of discovery occurs all the time. This is an article, April of this year, from the Wall Street Journal, pointing out that new discoveries continue to answer questions on evolutionary theory. And in this case, it was the spectacular discovery of an intermediate fossil in the Canadian Arctic that shows very clearly how the fins of lobed fin fishes evolved into the forelimbs of terrestrial or land-dwelling vertebrates. So the intermediate forms continue to show up. And we can look at the fossil record anywhere and see examples of new species formation. Here, for example, is the development of a new species that actually turns out to be a diatom by this process of diversification, exactly what Darwin suspected in the fossil record. And this species became increasingly diverse around 3.5 million years ago, split into 2. These 2 species went their separate ways, and as it turns out, they are both still with us today. So we see examples like this all the time. But if you're really passionately interested in evolution, you might say, well, you know, that's a diatom. I mean, nobody really cares about diatoms. Show me a species that I'm really interested in. So I figured I would do that today.